We're joined here today. I'm by Mike Howell, and who is the president of the Oversight Project, and Kyle Brosnan, who's the vice president of legal, the Oversight Project. Also with our DOJ reporter, Kaylin Dees, and our investigations editor, Sarah Bedford. I'm Chris Irvin, the managing editor of the Washington Examiner, and today we're going to really drill down into talking everything there is to know about the ongoing Autopen investigation and the access to the Biden presidency. Who was pulling the strings of the Biden presidency? Thanks very much, guys, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
I'll just start off by saying that the Autopen investigation is we it kind of taken on a life of its own, and underneath kind of all the other things going on in the world, there's still this scandal brewing at from the previous administration, and I think people who maybe aren't familiar with what this investigation is about and uh, what we mean when we say the Autopen investigation, it might be a good place to kind of start of where how we kind of got here and where we're going. So I think we can maybe talk a bit about the background to this and what we kind of expect in the future, and you guys can talk about some of the great work that you've been doing. But I think it's important as well to talk about how it's not necessarily just about the auto pen, it's about the access and the influence over President Biden, how he was doing mentally and whether his cognitive decline had got to such an extent that really other people were acting as a president. And I think hopefully this investigation, the work you're doing, the work that Congress is doing, will determine uh, how big a deal this is ultimately. I hope that kind of makes sense. Sarah, I might throw it to you. I know you said that you would like to kind of delve into talking about the auto pen and manipulation. But why don't you
Sure.
take
I
it
think that
away?
actually that sets perfectly into one way that sort of the evolution of my thinking about the auto pen. I started out when I first started hearing reports about the use of the auto pen, thinking like, oh my gosh, this is a really important line of inquiry for us journalists to look at, people using Biden's signature without his full knowledge. And then having conversations here in the newsroom with Chris, with Kaylin, we're all covering this story. I started to think, what if this narrow focus on the auto pen risks us losing sight of the bigger picture of whether there were aides who were guiding the Biden administration in, more liberal directions and making decisions without his full awareness. And there are broader storylines within that, national security implications, for example. But then, based off of even further conversations, including one with you, Kyle, I sort of started to see this distinction between political manipulation, right? Aides who are sort of guiding Biden to take positions that are maybe leftward of where he would be otherwise via statements to the press, or rhetorical manipulation, like loading things into the teleprompter that he wouldn't otherwise say. And the auto pen use for exercises of core constitutional presidential powers and powers that only the president has, like the pardon, and the way the auto pen sort of uniquely enabled that power to be taken away from the president with unelected aides, in a way that's sort of really distinct from other forms of manipulation that may or may not have occurred. So I guess my first question to Mike and Kyle is, do you sort of see that distinction between that makes the auto pen use a sort of unique potential constitutional violation?
Yeah, well, why don't I start real quick? And there's a lot of things there I'd like to kind of bounce off of. And basically, the first principles of this is like we did not have a president for 4 years. That is the biggest violation of our constitutional republic in our nation's history. It goes to the very nature of our form of government, the administrative state, and whether we have like a singular chief executive as the Constitution dictates, or we just, are run by committees and agencies and regulators and whatnot. And so the auto pen picked up because I think it gave symbol to that, what people intuitively understand. And also, like, everyone knew Biden was out of it. Whether left or right, everyone knew something was wrong. And so everyone has wondered who is the president. And what the Autopen investigation has showed is how you can operate without a president. It's but one of probably many instrumentalities and devices that they use to cover up Biden's decline and keep the White House operating. And so, like, of course, the Autopen is how you sign documents without a president. There probably are other things, obviously, like the media surrogacy that happened, the hiding of Biden, the handling of congressmen and senators, like, there are probably plenty of other types of ways they did things. But why don't I kick it over to Kyle since you referenced kind of where he left off, so he can pick up from there.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on Mike's point, it's a symptom of a broader disease of a rudderless executive branch without a leader. Um, the Constitution lays out that the president is the executive branch. The buck stops with him. The people elect him, and he is vested with certain powers that belong solely to him. That includes things like signing bills into law and issuing pardons and other acts of clemency. And the wet signature on those documents signifies only his assent, not only his assent to it, but that he is authorizing those actions to be taken. And so when he doesn't sign it himself, you have to dig deeper and look at whether or not that was authorized. But there's another wrinkle to this matter is with the president's clear mental decline while he's in office, is whether or not he had the capacity to authorize those actions. Special counsel Hur's investigation is very important. I think everyone gets distracted by the political ramifications of it, but it is a report by the Justice Department, which the president leads, that says he is too senile to stand trial for mishandling classified information. And when special counsel Hur testified to the House, he testified that he had enough evidence to get to a jury had a trial were to occur. So you have the chief prosecutor here saying he's got the president basically dead to rights on mishandling classified information, but that he made the decision not to prosecute him in large part because of the president's mental acuity. And so, we've seen gaffe after gaffe throughout his presidency. We've seen him fall down. There were signs of this long before the debate performance about the president's mental decline. And now we're getting the paper sort of behind the scenes of the scope and scale of how his administration was manipulating his office and his powers.
One thing that we reported on, and it came from you guys, I believe that this significance of the third signature, the third Autopen signature. Um, could you talk about the significance of that? Why is a third signature so important here?
So I think it
Sure.
gets to the fact that there are multiple signature types for different types of documents and the scale of AutoPen usage, which is completely out of accord with any historical use of the AutoPen, speaks to kind of what the controls existed, right? Like if there's one AutoPen signature used consistently in like these types of situations, you have a degree of confidence and trust that there is, less funny business that can occur. When you have multiple versions of it being deployed for multiple different things, it becomes a much more chaotic situation. And yesterday in the Senate hearing, this was brought out by the professor who testified. I'm blanking on his name, but the Senate was essentially asking like, how can we improve this process? And the professor was arguing the public needs trust that the president is actually assenting to these documents, and so some improvements could be made to make that a more reliable process. And what we're seeing with various types and the changes of the AutoPen usage are an unreliable process. It's harder to trust something that is more chaotic, more unpredictable. It has more types of things.
Kaylin, I'd like to bring you in here. There was the first hearing. It was in the Senate, as Mike just alluded to. It may have got somewhat kind of lost in the weeds and overshadowed by events yesterday, because we seem to be on the brink of World War III. But talk a little bit about the sort of the opening salvo from the Senate Republicans here. What were your takeaways from the first hearing, and where can you kind of see it going from here?
Right. So you should put zero faith and expectations in Congress to achieve an investigative outcome. Okay. Like everyone asks me, like, is Congress going to do it? And my answer is like, do we expect them to do it? Of course not. Like expect
Well,
them
I
to.
have a yeah, I have a question to bounce right off that, Mike. Not to interrupt, but
Yep.
I wanted to get your opinion, because there was a that the most significant part of the hearing yesterday to me was whenever that dialogue between Theo Wold, who was former counsel for Mike Lee and sits on the board of the Oversight Project, I believe. He was talking about sort of whether there was this paper trail that traces back to the office of the Secretary for former President Joe Biden regarding his ascent record, so to speak. Like the record in which we can look back and see like when did he assent to using the Autopen and maybe when he did not assent to using the Autopen. That was something that Senator Josh Hawley really got excited about whenever he was bringing that up. I'm curious, whether you think that there really, could be that information out there from, not just maybe Biden's presidency, but past presidencies as well. Do we know that there is some sort of record where you can see when a president did assent or not to using the Autopen? Because that seems to be like the next place that Hawley was getting at this investigation could go toward.
Correct. And the
I'll take
White
that.
House needs not a congressional request to release such things. The White House could just release them on their own accord. So like that is how Congress fits into this picture, even though they need not be in this picture. So that conversation with Senator Hawley and Theo was interesting in that very important part, the most important part of the hearing by far. And the nature of congressional hearings, like Theo had other things he could have said that were left out because Hawley, has 5 minutes. But the point Theo was making was there is traditionally, which doesn't mean the Biden administration kept it. It means traditionally in White Houses, there is a document that says here is who is allowed to use the Autopen, and here's what they can use it for. And then when it is used, there are logs created. Some took that to mean, or the impression I got on the Senate, that for every application of the signature, there should be a log of Biden saying, yes, I agree with that particular one. The logs kind of speak to the divesting of his authority, the delegation of it in the first instance. And so, like, yes, that is a necessary document to get for this investigation, but it is not sufficient to prove the overall thing. Like, you get that document and then you compare it against the other investigative material that needs to be gathered as to, all right, for this particular pardon, how did Biden assent to it? Who made the decision? And does it comport with the original delegation document?
So Kyle alluded earlier to there being sort of two levels of potential misdeeds from the aides, right? They could have just been out and out using the Autopen without Biden's knowledge, but there's another potentially more likely and more complicated scenario where aides were using the Autopen with Biden's knowledge, but he wasn't cognitively able to consent to the use of the Autopen in his name. He might not have understood the questions as he was being asked. And so when you have a paper trail that says, we've checked the box of asking Joe Biden the question, how do you as an investigator go the step further and learn from aides whether they understood that a yes from Biden was not a true yes from someone who was capable of understanding their question?
Right. So this ultimately, and like we've taken this into the red zone, to use a football metaphor. We drove the whole field. We're at the 15-yard line based on our investigation, which do not have available to us compulsory process and access to government information inside the White House. So there are certain things that we have encouraged, and we've spoken to all the investigative bodies looking into this, that they should do. They should compel the testimony of all the people in that circle. They should compel the testimony of Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, who have said they have 200 sources. They know exactly how this is going down. Tapper and Thompson refused to testify in front of the Senate yesterday. That's kind of got lost in the mix. People will say, oh, but those are like sources, they're journalists. There's a Supreme Court case that says, Brandsburg v. Hayes, 1972, you cannot hide your sources behind a newsman privilege in a criminal investigation if they convene a grand jury. So I would like to see a grand jury convened and have Alex Thompson and Tapper answer questions. If not, congressional subpoenas and other forms of compulsory process. So you do what January 6th committee did. Like we aren't inventing anything new. Like the processes exist. You go after the text messages, the emails, the bank records, everything for these people, and you start to paint a picture. And then you start getting people in rooms and asking the hard questions about like how these certain decisions came to be made. They'll cite executive privilege and say, I don't have to answer you. I was an advisor to the president. Then Trump should waive the executive privilege, just like Biden waived executive privilege for January 6th related matters for people who were advising Trump. And then you start to wrap them up that way, just like any other criminal investigation.
So I got a question on the Democrat response to this, and we've seen them kind of run this playbook before where the Democrats and the legacy media almost kind of treat this as trivial questions or disinformation, and it's not important. We need to move on, especially with Joe Biden's cancer diagnosis. Now is not the right time to dredge up his past. And I saw the Democrats yesterday went to pains to almost not engage and then do whataboutism when it comes to Trump's mental faculties. How do you kind of break through that? And you're combating all the other news that's out there. I know that we should be able as a society to walk and chew gum at the same time, but how do you kind of break through that noise and just and really kind of hammer home the the Democrats don't have a leg to stand on here, and this is the biggest presidential scandal of modern times. Because I'm already seeing it kind of sort of down page in a lot of other outlets. Like, but it strikes me as almost bizarre that it's being treated already as this. Oh well, it's just kind of over here. We got other things to worry about.
Yeah, two points. And sorry, Kyle, I'll kick it over to you after this one. But the first one is I'm glad they didn't show up to the hearing yesterday. They're criminal suspects in this investigation. They should have first probably been testifying, and second, they shouldn't participate in an investigation in which they have culpability, which in some instances will be criminal in nature. They're the ones, as Joe Biden's longtime colleagues and the ones with access to him, who have relevant information about the criminal conspiracy and also were engaged in misprision of a felony potentially by not saying anything or doing anything about it, whether it relates to the impersonation of a president, forgery, potential bribery, and other trades that were going on. Adam Schiff has a funky, no good, bogus pardon that was signed by an Autopen in the final days. He should be charged for the crimes that he admitted guilt to when he accepted that pardon. So, of course, Schiff does not want to see an investigation into this. Some people could go to jail and should go to jail, in my mind, over this. And so we need to treat this like the criminal conspiracy that it was and still is to a certain degree because people are covering up relevant information. And, the second more rhetorical point is, I was led to believe by the Democrats and others that democracy was under attack and hanging on by a thread, and Trump was going to kill it, and he's a fascist. I don't know how they square that point with the biggest constitutional abuse I think we have in our nation's history, where we operated a country without a president, without democracy actually working. The one time in our country's course of every few years where everyone elects one person, quote unquote, they elected Joe Biden. I don't think they elected Joe Biden. But yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you real quick before we get too far away from it, because you were talking about impaneling grand juries and things like that. I just wanted to ask real quick, like whether you think that, in the way that this would work, would it be the U.S. Attorney's Office, or would it be the D.C. Attorney's Office that would handle this? And like, how would that necessarily, affect confirmation in your view? Just like, gaming that out just for a second, if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's several places and forms this could take, and some of it depends on what investigative theory the government wants to lean in and where, like venue. And it could be a U.S. attorney. It could be a special counsel, although I doubt they would want to do a special counsel. It could be through the weaponization working group. It could be in compliance with the executive order that was issued directing the AG. It could be in Delaware, where it looks like the Biden family spend most of their time. It could be elsewhere. It could be where Hunter was. It could be where Joe was. It could be where the other aides were. It could be where the money moved. And so there's no shortage of ability to stand something up to answer these questions.
I could just say, what did you see yesterday at the Senate hearing, Mike and Kyle, whoever wants to answer this, that you feel like, as we know, the House is doing a more thorough look at the actual aides, looking, at people like Ron Klain, looking at people like Kevin O'Connor, Biden's doctor. Obviously, we're seeing thoroughness from the House that we're, like we saw a 30,000-foot view from the Senate yesterday. So do you think that that's going to, prove more fruitful in your view? Do you think that the Senate handled it well? Do you think they need to get deeper in the way that the House is going? How do you square what that side of the Congress is doing with what the House is doing? Because I think that to most people seeing this out here, the House looks like it's taking this a lot more seriously, at least on the Autopen regard.
So I view it as the opening salvo. I mean, I think the senators learned a lot just in terms of the widespread use of the auto pen sort of mechanically, what we found thus far. Senator Schmidt, who co-chaired the hearing yesterday, is a subcommittee chairman, and I think he put on X last night that he will be sending a special access request. So Mike had mentioned this earlier, but some of the records are prohibited from public release under the Presidential Records Act, but committee chairman and potentially subcommittee chairman can have access to those under the Presidential Records Act if they submit a special access request. And so, if he does submit those requests, great. I mean, I know Chairman Comer's doing, a bit more aggressive in getting people to volunteer to come in, starting next week, I believe. But you got to get the paper and then question the people with the paper to see if they lie to you. Because at a minimum, there's potential perjury there, but in addition to the broader, potential criminal liability that Mike discussed earlier. And so, Congress hasn't gotten many investigations right over the last, decade or so. So hopefully that yesterday's hearing sort of outlining the problem, identifying, places to go and putting those breadcrumbs down on the ground will lead to a positive outcome here.
And Caleb, let me put a really blunt point on it. Like, there's obviously always a danger in Congress opening an investigation that it becomes a political talking point and controlled demolition just to generate cable news appearances and X, clips. That can happen here. And I'll let you know how to test whether it's going to happen or not. If they're serious about it, they'll take the most obvious first step and subpoena Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. This isn't a complicated investigation. It's not rocket science. These guys have run around the country, said they have 200 sources who knew how Biden was propped up. They're not naming names. They're doing this limited hangout of like, oh, we were tricked. We know something you don't know, though. And it's all these people that told us all these things. If they want to do their patriotic duty and fulfill their legal obligations, they'll tell the investigators. But that requires the investigators to actually compel them to do so.
Just on you briefly mentioned the likes of Ron Klain, and I think ultimately the answer everybody wants is who are the key names behind this? Who controlled the Autopen? Who controlled access to the Oval Office? I know that we've got some aides coming up, but are there any particular names that you're particularly curious about that you'll be watching very closely, putting Thompson and Tapper to one side? And the reason I ask that is because, the president mentioned Lisa Monaco the other day. We've seen the likes of, I think Elizabeth Warren was even mentioned, which doesn't seem particularly helpful in this grand context. So who are the kind of key players that you're zeroing in on?
So Monaco is definitely running the DOJ. There's no mistake about that. In terms of like the White House, you have two categories of types of people that we've kind of been speaking about. One is like the implementation arm of the staff, the people who move the paper and like affix the actual signature and push the button. So there you have like the traditional types of jobs that would be involved in those decisions. The chief of staff, Ron Klain, the staff secretary, Neera Tanden, other sorts of senior advisors. But I don't think they're ultimately the ones that were making the decisions, giving the orders to do what needed to be done. I think that was like a Politburo above them. I think that involves the longtime Biden kind of handlers, obviously including his family. And so that's where I think decisions were ultimately made. But I think people get lost a little bit and miss the context of how the Biden White House actually operated. Like, of course, the presidential papers that he needed to put a signature on were major decisions. But if you look at like the biggest pieces of legislation, how the Biden administration governed, the Inflation Act, the chips, the IRA, and the COVID bill, like these, like that's like $4 trillion, right? And instead of having that money go out through the departments, they brought in people like, Kerry and Mitch Landrieu and then John Podesta, of all people, at the White House to decide how that money was actually like doled out and implemented. They rewarded lots of people. This is the gold bars flying off the Titanic at the EPA. And so like the Autopen like makes the decision to like sign these major things, which then makes the money and the power available to other real decision makers who may have been engaged in the criminal conduct that I'm pointing out that relates to like bribery. Like I think it's potentially bribery or some other criminal thing that Mitch Landrieu gave out all the infrastructure money and then instantly turned around and went to the Biden campaign where he cashed in on all those political favors that he just earned via government money. And this is where Congress has really failed. What did Congress do during the last 2 years of the Biden administration to understand how that money went in? A bunch of just like whiz kids from Doge came in and were like, oh, you guys missed like the billions of dollars that just flew out of EPA because Congress refused to actually investigate because they'd rather go on cable news and write letters and do performative antics.
I want to sort of close by thinking through, let's say that the investigation uncovers the sorts of things that you're alleging, that this unelected Politburo of longtime Biden aides and his family members were making decisions on behalf of the president, and in the specific case of just the stack of papers that were signed by the Autopen, pardons, executive orders, and things of that nature. Let's say the investigation uncovers that Biden definitively did not consent to his signature being affixed on those orders and that those were made by sort of executive fiat from his aides. What comes after that? Do those pardons get invalidated? How do the courts handle this? I mean, this is sort of uncharted historical territory. And how does that get litigated, or is it sort of too late to claw back those last minute uses of executive power?
Not too late. Not too late at all. President Trump has already declared them to be invalid from the perspective of the executive branch. So we're waiting on DOJ to actually charge those people. Of course, they will claim they have a perfectly good pardon, and then the process will play out in court, which could be supported by these other investigative means that are underway. But never too late. And the people who did these things, who knew about these things, and then who also probably profited or did something else criminally related to them, should go to jail. That's what should happen. Like we go to wars to quote unquote defend democracy. People should go to jail if they defied it, which they openly did for a long period of time.
I mean, what you have here is if the investigations show that the president did not authorize using the auto pen, this is a coup d'état in the simplest sense, and people need to be held accountable for that. I think the cleanest way you would challenge something along those lines is, President Biden basically undid the death penalty in America when he commuted the prison sentences of 37 out of 40 people on federal death row. And his staff or him or whomever wrote the statement basically said it was a policy disagreement over the death penalty. But the death penalty is still a valid law on the books in the United States. And the jury, and multiple appeals decided to sentence those people to deaths for horrific crimes. And so if it is found out that he didn't personally authorize those prison commutations, I would think the Trump Justice Department is well within their rights to, set an execution date for some of these horrific criminals. And then it would be off to the races to sort of litigate, the veracity of the pardon there. But we got to get the facts first and see where they lead us.
And one final point, and sorry I'm hot on this. There's something nobody's talking about that I'd like to share with you guys. Her special counsel, recommended not to prosecute Joe Biden. That is a non-binding recommendation. What her also failed to investigate, probably on purpose, was what Biden did with those classified documents during his period where he wasn't supposed to have them, when he was also engaged in international pay to play, and his family was. The Trump administration could charge President Biden. They could reject the recommendation of her and put him up for trial. That would uncover a lot of things related to this.